Today I'm going to be telling you a little bit about CBT. What is CBT, and also how do we get the most out of CBT? I'm going to be telling you a few things that I think therapists would want you to know about CBT. So just to begin with, just to let you know where you can get more help. Today, this is some very generic advice, but obviously it is important that you seek professional help if you need it. You can always go to your doctor, your GP, to sort of discuss any difficulties you might have, and they can often refer you to talking therapies. If you are in England, then you can find your local IAPT service, IAPT. That stands for Improving Access to Psychological Therapies. And if you follow this link here in the middle, you can self-refer online. You can sign up and find your local service and sign yourself up for free psychological therapies under the NHS. And that does include CBT-based therapies. Equally, if you need to find your local mental health helpline, there's a link here which will help you find your local area's number. And of course, if there is an emergency or you feel like yourself or someone else can't keep themselves safe, then please do call 999 or go to A&E. So just to have a look at what is CBT. CBT is a doing therapy. And what CBT is often based on is looking at the vicious cycles of our moods, the patterns that we can get trapped in. And the idea is if we have that self-awareness and understand the patterns that we get trapped in, then we can look at breaking those patterns and breaking these vicious cycles. Now, this is a very basic but very common cycle that you might look at in CBT. And this is called the ABCE cycle, or sometimes people call it a hot cross bun because it looks a bit like a hot cross bun in the middle. And this basic cycle is a very simple way to understand most day-to-day difficulties. So A stands for autonomic or physical symptoms. So what's happening in your body when you're struggling? What physical symptoms are you noticing when you're maybe anxious or feeling low? There will be a change in your body. B is our behaviours. These are the things that we might do differently when we're struggling. That might be things that we sometimes stop doing or avoid doing if we're feeling anxious or low. It might be unhelpful coping strategies that we have, or just things that we change and act differently when we're feeling in a certain way. C stands for our cognitions or our thoughts. So these are the things that are going through our mind when we're feeling low or anxious, the things that we say to ourselves in our head, those critical thoughts we might have about ourselves, or those worries or difficult memories that pop up. And we can think in all kinds of ways. Some of us think in words, some of us think in more picture form, some of us think almost like seeing a videotape, or some of us think by sort of hearing our words. And lastly, E stands for emotions. So this is looking at our moods, our feelings, how we're feeling emotionally. And the idea is that all these areas affect each other. So if we're struggling with our physical symptoms, that might affect the things that we do in our day, that might affect how we're thinking about ourselves, and that's going to in turn affect our feelings, which again affects our physical symptoms. And they also affect each other across. So if you're feeling bad emotionally, it might affect what you're doing. If you're doing things, it's going to have an impact on your feelings and so forth. I'll give you an example to explain it a bit better. Let's look at a common example of depression. Now, if we're depressed, common physical symptoms we might have is feeling quite tired, not having any energy. We might struggle to get to sleep. We might struggle with insomnia, or we might sleep too much with depression. That's also very common. Depression can be a little bit like adult hibernation, and we can lose our appetite, we can lose our energy, we can lose our sex drive, our motivation, we can struggle to concentrate. And it's quite common as well, people might feel quite slow, or the opposite, we can feel quite restless and fidgety when we're depressed. Now, if someone is feeling very tired and not motivated, it makes sense it's going to affect their behaviours. So someone who's depressed might struggle to get out of bed. They might spend a lot of time napping in bed. They might spend more time ruminating and dwelling on things. They might withdraw and spend time on their own. They might stop socializing or stop doing their hobbies. They might struggle to stay on top of their chores. Sometimes people might struggle with their personal hygiene, or they might avoid some difficulties like essays or sorting out your finances. And again, if we're not doing as much, we're going to have more time to overthink. And if we're not doing as much, we're probably going to feel a bit bad about ourselves and struggle with our self-esteem. So that in turn can also affect our thoughts. And it's very common with depression, we might have thoughts that we're useless or a burden. We might have thoughts life's pointless or that we've got a gloomy future. We might worry about things that are going to happen in the future or dwell on the mistakes in our past. We can have all types of thoughts going on for our head when we're feeling depressed. And of course, this is going to affect our emotions and how we're feeling. And the cycle goes forward and forward. And they all affect each other and interact with each other. Now, it's important to understand your vicious cycle. And in CBT, there's lots more complicated diagrams and lots more in-depth ways of understanding things. But this is just a very simple thing I thought I would share with you. But the point to it is that CBT often starts by understanding your vicious cycle. And from there, you would then look at what things can we do to break this vicious cycle and stop it continuing. So it might be we can start changing your behaviors. It might be we could work on your routine, your motivation. If you're anxious, it might be helping you to face your fears. It might be we look at challenging your negative thoughts, helping you to manage worry or stop ruminating on things. It might be for physical symptoms. We can look at things like sleep hygiene, helping you to sleep better. And the idea is if we change one of these areas, then we break the cycle and we stop it going round and round and just continuing. And that is essentially what CBT is all about, understanding your vicious cycle, your difficult patterns, and working on ways with your therapists, looking at how we can break that cycle. And that's often through changing your behaviours or looking at changing your thinking patterns. And that's why it's called CBT, cognitive behaviour therapy, because we're usually changing our cognitions, our thoughts, or our behaviours, the things that we do. So just to tell you a bit more about CBT, this is generally the sort of stages of therapy someone might go through. So it's very common that someone will, first of all, have an initial assessment. And this assessment, the idea is it would look at understanding what are the difficulties you're coming to therapy for, discussing your goals and what you want from therapy, and making sure that CBT is also the right therapy for you and that is the best fit to help you. Assessments sometimes take one session, sometimes they might take a couple of sessions to sort of thoroughly explore your problems, and that's quite common. What tends to happen next is you go into what we call a formulation phase. And the idea is this is where you and your therapist would come together and start to draw up what we call a formulation or a diagram of your problems, understanding your vicious cycles as an individual, and both of you and your therapist looking at really digesting and understanding how all these problems link together and what's keeping the problems going. Often there's a learning phase in therapy too, where your therapist might give you certain information or teach you things. This could be, for example, understanding depression or understanding the physical symptoms of anxiety, understanding how sleep works. There might be some information that your therapist thinks would be really helpful to go through with you. Now, the large part of therapy would look at evidence-based CBT techniques. Because, of course, CBT is a doing therapy. It's all about making changes to stop these vicious cycles from continuing. It's all about making changes to help you cope differently and to improve your mood as a result. So There will be a large part of therapy where you'll be exploring different techniques with your therapists, looking at different ways of coping. And like I said, that could be looking at thought techniques, it could be looking at the behaviors and the things that you're doing day to day. Now, as you come towards the end of therapy, it's common that therapists will spend time with you making what's called a relapse prevention plan, or sometimes people call this a therapy blueprint. And basically, this is helping you to digest everything that you've learned in therapy and to look at how you're going to continue moving forward by yourself, how you're going to continue to keep that progress up, and how you can continue working on yourself even when the therapy sessions are finished. And the idea is this will also help you to prevent relapsing and prevent sort of going back and getting back to that bad place again. So those are the common stages of therapy. Now, one thing that's really important to think of, if you're thinking to yourself, you know, should I go to therapy? First of all, a common question that I hear people say is, am I bad enough to need therapy? Now, if you're even asking yourself that question, the likelihood is that, you know, something might be difficult in your life and there might be something you want to work on. And if there is, then that's really important that you do seek support. And there's lots of different levels and types of therapy that people can have. In IAPT, you'll hear people talk about low intensity CBT and high intensity CBT. And low intensity therapies are very short term therapies that help problems to stop getting worse and stop getting bigger and to nip them in the bud quite quickly. For problems that are maybe more severe or long standing, then high intensity therapy can be really beneficial too, especially for sort of common mental health disorders. But the idea is that therapy isn't just about going when things are really, really difficult and things are the worst they can be. You can also go to therapy before they get that bad and to prevent things from getting out of hand for yourself. So it's well worth seeking therapy to find out what options are available for you. And therapy comes in lots of different forms as well. Therapy comes in group forms. Some people have an online therapy program. Some people engage in webinars and online sort of videos like this one. Other people have the classic, you know, one-to-one therapies where they're working on their problems face-to-face with a therapist. But there's other different forms of that nowadays too. It might be you have telephone sessions or webcam sessions, especially with the pandemic. But a good thing to ask yourself if you're considering therapy is to have a think about, is therapy the right choice for you at the moment? Because therapy is a commitment. So it's important to ask yourself, you know, can you commit to regular sessions? Sometimes therapy is fortnightly, sometimes it's weekly, but are you able to make that commitment of your time? And of course, if you are seeking therapy privately and not on the NHS, you might also have to ask yourself, am I able to afford this right now if you're paying privately? Therapy does often include practicing homework, especially CBT-based therapies. So again, can you commit to making changes and practicing homework outside of the sessions? Also, it's important to think about, are you in the right place and are you ready to open up and explore your thoughts, your feelings, your difficulties and your behaviours? Are you ready to open up and talk about things that are quite personal and often quite hard to talk about? Now, it's very natural that everyone would be quite anxious about that and quite nervous about it. And you do have to be ready to get yourself at a stage to talk about things. Now, your therapist is there to help you to open up and to build trust with them. No therapist would expect you to tell them absolutely everything straight away because we know it's difficult. But obviously, you do have to be willing to discuss things in therapy. It's good to ask yourself, are you ready to make changes and do some hard work? Therapy isn't a passive process. Therapy isn't something that is done to you. You're a part of the therapy process. So are you ready to make some changes and to talk about things and do some hard work? Are you ready to change things in your life? Because ultimately, the most important part of therapy is you making those changes in your life, and you've got to be ready to do that. Now, another good question to ask yourself sometimes is there something that I need help with before I start therapy? So if you're moving house, for example, or moving country, it might mean that you need to settle down before you start therapy. If you've just had a new baby or you're pregnant, it might be important to ask yourself, is now the right time for me to have therapy? And it could be, and it's fine. We do work with mothers as well. You might need to work on practical issues first, like your benefits or getting safe housing. Or if you've got a court case and you're very busy with that, it might be that you need to let things run their course first. If you've just started a new job, you might want to give it a few weeks to settle in first, because therapy is quite demanding. So it is going to take a lot of time and effort. And therapy ultimately can be quite emotional and upsetting. If you're working on big things and emotions, then you're going to have to be prepared to get a little bit upset at times in therapy. So it is important that you're at the right place in your life to commit to therapy and to do those things. So it is worth thinking about when is the right time for you. But I don't want that to put you off. I've had therapy myself and I found it really valuable. It has really changed sort of many big things in my life. And it was scary coming to therapy and talking about things, but I am really glad I did it. And there is help out there for everyone. Things can be different. So I'd say it is worthwhile going for therapy. But like I say, just have a think about when you're ready to make that step. Now, just a word of, I guess, caution or something to look out for. It is very important that you find yourself a therapist who is a qualified therapist and an accredited therapist to work with your type of difficulty. And some therapists specialize in things. So you might get therapists that specialize in things like trauma or OCD. And again, you want to make sure that a therapist works with your kind of problem you're going for. Now, in the UK, there's something called the BABCP, and this is an accrediting body. And if a CBT therapist is BABCP accredited, it means that they've got the right credentials, they've had the right training, they've had the right supervision, and they've met the right sort of levels of training and the right standards to be a CBT therapist. There are some people that will do a 3-day online course and say that they're a CBT therapist, but they're not. It takes years to become a CBT therapist, and you want to make sure that you're having a therapist who's experienced enough, who's qualified and trained enough. So it is very important that you look for someone who's had sufficient training and at a good standard, not just a few days course. It's literally taking the years to become a CBT therapist. So you can find out more information on the BABCP website. And there's also what's called the CBT register. And this is a joint public register. And you can find accredited CBT therapists on that register. And you can also check if your CBT therapist is accredited. If you're seeing a therapist under the NHS or in an IAPT service, then they're either currently on a training course, training for their CBT accreditation and qualifications. And in that case, they'll be supervised by a qualified therapist, and they'll be supervised by a university who'll be making sure that they're working with you properly. Or you'll be working with a qualified therapist in the NHS, and the NHS does their own checks. But if you're going privately and you're seeking a private therapist, I would recommend that you make sure that that therapist is adequately qualified to work with you. So let's talk now about what I think therapists would want you to know, and some tips from me about how to get the most out of CBT. So first of all, it is important that you go into therapy with realistic expectations. Have a think about what it is that you want from therapy. What are your goals? What are your priorities as well? If you're having short-term therapy, then it's likely that you're going to have to focus on some specific priorities, because if you've got a time limit on how many sessions you have, you might not be able to cover everything. So really have a good think about what are your priorities and what are your goals. It is important to say that CBT teaches you lots of different tools and techniques. And in a way, it's a little bit like driving a car. I learned to drive a car in a Clio, I think. And I did all my lessons driving a Clio. But the idea is that once you've done your driving lessons, you can drive any type of car, can't you? You don't just drive Clios for the rest of your life. And it's a little bit like that with therapy as well. Therapy will teach you tools and techniques to deal with some of your difficulties. But the idea is that you're always going to know those tools and techniques, and you can then apply them to other difficulties in your life. Just to mention as well, CBT isn't a magic wand. It's not something that the therapist is going to be able to fix you instantly. And a therapist isn't going to do things to you or fix you. The idea is therapy is an active process. It's going to take time. You're going to be making small steps together to make some gradual process. And it does take hard work and effort. And therapy isn't something the therapist does to you. It's something that you both work on together. The therapist's job is to help you learn to understand yourself and to teach you different ways of coping so that you can make the changes yourself. A therapist could have a million sessions with you, but if you're not practicing the techniques or trying to learn the information, then it's not going to change anything in your life. You're the one that has to apply the techniques and make the changes in your life to see a difference. Another thing with CBT, it can't necessarily change your situation. If you don't have a job, maybe if you're being bullied at work, if you hate the home that you're living on, CBT can't change those things. But what CBT can do is it can help you learn to cope with your situation. It can help you learn different coping strategies to manage the problems you have in your day-to-day life. And just to mention something really important, although you're seeing a therapist or a professional and you want their expertise, obviously they're the expert that knows about the CBT, it's important to say that you're the expert on you. So a CBT therapist will ask you, what do you want out of therapy and what do you think is going to help? What do you want to start on? Because you're the one that knows you best. And it's important that you take an active role in your treatment. CBT isn't like going to the doctor where the doctor does things to you or gives you a medication and they fix you. CBT is an active process where you're actively working with the therapist to make changes in your life. And that means that you're a part of the work here. So some tips now for getting the most out of therapy. First of all, attendance is really important. You need to be attending your sessions regularly in order to keep that momentum and that progress going. If you miss chunks of sessions or you only attend every other week, then the pace and the speed of which you progress is going to be a lot slower. It's a little bit like going to the gym. If you want to develop muscles and you want to get fitness, you have to go regularly, don't you? You have to keep putting in the work and you have to work hard and keep going. And it's exactly the same with your mental health and therapy. You need to be going regularly to see the results. Now, there are some services that will discharge you if you miss a lot of sessions or if you miss a lot of sessions in a row, because it does affect how effective CBT is. So it is important that you do commit to attending regularly. Of course, it's important that you're open and honest with yourself and your therapist. I know a lot of people say, oh, can you read your mind because you work in psychology? But actually, therapists aren't mind readers. And if there's something that you're not telling a therapist or something that you're not sharing, they might not know unless you tell them. So it is important that you are open about your difficulties. And like I say, that's going to take time, and therapists respect that. It's going to take time to build trust with your therapist, and they will be there to help open up and help you through that process. But of course, that works both ways. Your therapist needs to help you open up, but you also need to do some of the work and try and be open and honest as much as you can. Another good tip for me is really helpful to get yourself a therapy notebook or even have like a file or a folder. I really like it if a patient wants to pause and just write a note to remind themselves of something during a session. Especially if you struggle with your memory, it's really helpful for you to take notes, and that's absolutely fine. Or you might want to take notes after you've had the session just to remind yourself of what you covered. And it's really good to keep any worksheets, any information, any handouts your therapist gives you. And that way, once you've finished therapy, you've also got a nice folder of all the stuff that you covered, and you can go back to that and remind yourself at any point. So that's just a little tip for me. It's really helpful to have that. As I said, you're the expert on you. So at the start of a CBT session, it's very common that the therapist will set an agenda with you, and they might bring things that they think would be helpful for you both to cover in the session. But the therapist is also going to want to know from you what you want to cover in the session and what you think is helpful to talk about that day. So it's always worth, before you go into your therapy session, just to have a think about what you want this session to include or work on, and to let your therapist know that, so they can make sure they're covering what you want to work on. Alongside that, therapists really do want your feedback. And you might often have a therapist ask you at the end of their session, how do you think the therapy's going? Was there anything that's helpful today? Was there anything that wasn't helpful? And we don't just ask that to be polite. We really want to know how the therapy's going for you. We want to know what you want out of therapy, and we want to know what's helpful or what's not working, so that we can make sure that the therapy is working for you and it's meeting all your needs. If one technique doesn't work, that's fine as well. It's okay to tell your therapist, I don't think this is working for me. It might be the therapist needs to help you to sort of use that effectively, or it might be that actually they're going to change approach with you and find something else that fits you instead. But you're a part of this process, and therapists really do want to know what's working and what's not. We also really want you to tell us if we've told you something that doesn't make sense or you don't understand it. We're very happy to explain it in a different way or help you understand. So please do tell us if that's the case. And please do ask questions too. Therapists want to help you learn. They want to help you make progress. And if you don't understand what they're talking about, it's okay to ask. We're happy to answer any questions. It's good to consider therapy like a sort of testing ground. It's kind of a bit like a laboratory where you can, sort of explore new ways of coping. You can test different things out. You can look at different hypotheses and ideas. You can make sense of things together with your therapist. And a big part of therapy, I guess, is being open-minded to try different approaches and to see what works. And if one thing doesn't work, like I said, that's fine. It might just be that you have to adjust it, or it might just be that actually you need to try something new altogether, and that's okay. If you think about when the men went to the moon for the very first time, they had to constantly adjust all the maths and adjust all the figures, and they had to course correct the rocket along the way to make sure it got to the moon. And therapy is a little bit like that too. If you're traveling slightly off in one direction and you're not quite getting where you need to go, then therapy might just slightly adjust the course to make sure that you're targeting the right things. And it's absolutely fine for you and your therapist to adjust things and try different approaches. It is a bit experimental. It's also really helpful to take time after your therapy session to reflect on what you covered that session. I think it's really helpful to write a few notes to yourself and have a think about what it is that you've learned from that session, what it is that you've taken away from that session. And it's quite helpful sometimes to write bullet points on that. What are the key messages? What are the key things that therapist told me? What stood out for me in that session today? And that's also really helpful to remind yourself throughout the week what you covered, or even years later when you go back to your therapy notebooks and want to see what you covered and just remind yourself. It's also a really helpful way for you to just learn and digest that learning. And, an hour goes really quick. So it's nice to have notes and just give yourself time to take it all in. Have a think about what that information means to you. All that stuff that you've learned today, what are you going to do with that information? If you've got any homework, it's good to reflect on how you're going to do that. What is the homework? How are you going to move forward from this session? And you might also have questions from that session, or things you didn't quite understand, or things that pop up during the week. And that's okay, again, to write those down and ask them the following session. Now, I mentioned homework, and in CBT, it's very common that you will set homework with your therapist, or some people call it an action plan or a home project. Now, just to mention, homework is set to benefit you. Your therapist isn't setting it just because they have to set it. They're setting it because therapy isn't just an hour a week. Therapy doesn't just happen in the therapy room. In fact, a lot of CBT therapy has to happen outside of the session with you applying the techniques to real life situation. And that means that you need to be making progress and making changes outside of the sessions as well. Now, that might sound scary, and it's important to mention that homework isn't pass or fail. If you really struggle with the homework and it doesn't quite go to plan, or you have a difficulty, or you have some sort of setback that you weren't expecting, that's okay, because you can learn a lot from that by discussing that with your therapist. Your therapist doesn't expect every single piece of homework to go perfectly. If it did, you wouldn't need therapy. You'd be able to do it all by yourself anyway. Your therapist's job is to discuss how the homework went with you and to discuss any difficulties and to help you learn and progress. So your therapist is expecting you to not find it easy. They're just expecting you to give it a go and to try it. And they'll be willing to discuss how it went with you the next week. So homework shouldn't feel scary. Homework should feel like a piece of work for you to do and just reflect on with your therapist the next week. And equally, your homework should be manageable. It shouldn't feel like it's too much to do. You need to be setting realistic homework with your therapist so you're not setting yourself up to fail. That's really important too. Homework should set you up for success, but it's okay if it doesn't go to plan. So ending therapy, once you've had your therapy sessions, it can be quite scary for people to think about finishing CBT. And one thing I would like everyone to know is that therapy is often the start of your recovery journey. And the idea is that CBT wants to equip you with different coping skills and techniques, basically with the aim to help you become your own therapist. If I work with a patient and they tell me that they don't think they need me anymore, they know what they're doing, they've got the tools, they're working for them, they know how to use them, that's my job done. Ultimately, I want to give someone a coping strategy so that then they know how to use them themselves and they can keep using them on their own. So it might mean that you finish therapy and you still need more time to use the tools. It might be that you need to use these tools for life. And that's okay. That just means that you've learned a different way of coping and you need to keep doing that. It's also okay to need time after therapy just to digest everything that you've learned, because you do learn so much. So you might need some time just to think about everything that you covered, to read all of the stuff that you covered with your therapist and read your notes, and to give yourself time just to really put things into practice on your own. That's really important. And it's very common as well that there are still things that you want to work on in therapy. When therapy stops, the work doesn't stop. You can still keep the progress going yourself. And actually, one thing that I recommend to my patients is that once your sessions end, have a think about what you're going to do with the hour a week session. It might be that you want to actually have an appointment with yourself. You might want to have that time to sort of check in with yourself, have a think about how you've been doing this week. You might want to remind yourself of some of the stuff you covered in therapy. And you might want to sort of set a plan for coping the week ahead and set yourself goals to keep working on. It's about becoming your own therapist, and you can give yourself your own sessions. Now, you might not want to do that every week. It might be you start off fortnightly, then monthly, then every few months. But it can be a really useful thing to use that time for yourself. Or you might want to use that time a different way. You might want to start a new hobby or try an evening class or something else in that time. But you made the space for therapy, so it's lovely to keep that space for you. And also just to mention that it's okay to need a refresher and to need some more therapy later on in your life. I've had therapy more than once. One of my colleagues, I really like what they say. They said therapy is a little bit like building a house. And in your therapy sessions, you might set some really good foundations and they might teach you how to lay the bricks. And then when your therapy ends, you might still need to build a few walls and keep practicing the techniques that you've learned to do that. But every now and again, you might need to, build a wall that's crumbling, or you might want to add an extension. And it's okay to want to come back to therapy and have a bit of a refresher. What I would say is give yourself time to digest the techniques that you've learned in therapy and practice what you've learned. Give yourself a bit of space to do that first. And if things do start to lapse a little bit, that's a really important time for you to refresh yourself on those skills and try what worked for you before. Obviously, if things keep going and you feel like, actually, I can't do this by myself, and do come back to therapy. That's okay. One last word. Therapy and recovery isn't linear. Lots of people think that, they're just going to keep getting better and better and better and better. And that's rarely the case. In fact, I've never seen that happen for anybody. You're going to have good days and you're going to have bad days. You're going to have weeks where you feel like you've taken a step back or a step sideways, and other weeks where you feel like you're doing really well. And that's okay. The point is that you are still progressing. It's just, it does take time. Recovery means taking small steps and making small changes. And it might not be that you take the big leap and suddenly fix your life like you were hoping for. It might take a bit longer than you expected. But the point is that it's going in the right direction. Now, a normal part of recovery is to have bad days and to have bad weeks and to have setbacks. That's life, and that's perfectly normal. And there's a very big difference between what we call a lapse, which is a slight sort of difficult blip, and a relapse, which is where you're completely back to square one. And lapses are a normal part of life. Even me as a therapist, I have bad weeks. I have times where I cry and get really anxious. There are days where I really struggle and don't feel like I'm coping very well. And that's normal. That's a part of life. And recovery doesn't mean you're never going to have bad feelings again or difficult days. That's not realistic. Realistic recovery means that you've got coping skills that you can use. You've got new ways of doing things, and you do have some bad days, but ultimately you are progressing and you've made some improvements. That's what realistic recovery is. So just to mention to you one last time, if you do want to refer for CBT under the NHS, use this link here and you can find your local IAPT service. You can self-refer online and sign up for an assessment, and then they'll look at what options for talking therapies and CBT would suit your needs. Or like I say, you can speak to your GP, you can speak to your doctor, and they can also often refer you for talking therapies. If you do want to find a therapist privately, it's a really good thing to look on the BABCP website, and that way you can make sure that you're seeing a CBT therapist who is qualified and accredited, so that you know that you're in safe hands. Thank you very much for listening today. It's been a pleasure as always, and I hope this was helpful.